Let's be honest, this past summer was supposed to be that big moment when everything would change. The cinematic offensive that the Kremlin had been promising for months, when the fate of the war would finally be decided. The moment we had all heard about for decades, when the famous Russian army would finally reveal itself, tear through the Ukrainian defenses, and put an end to the war. But it didn't happen. Instead of a victory march, this attempt, like the previous ones, hit a wall. The offensive turned not into a victory, but into a painful fiasco. And now, for Vladimir Putin, the situation at the front is evolving beyond a stalemate into a complete collapse. The latest statistics emerging brutally reveal what this war is really costing the Kremlin. Some military observers note that the total loss ratio has reached approximately 5 times that of Ukraine's. Yet that's not how the story began, is it? On paper, Russia, entering the fray in 2022 as one of the planet's most feared military superpowers, with its massive army, seemingly unlimited defense budget, and enormous stockpile of equipment, was expected to dominate Ukraine from day one. On the other side, there was a nation with a much smaller army, not seen as a military giant on the world stage. Logically, this should have ended in a glorious victory in 2022, as Putin had envisioned when he gave that first invasion order. Instead, Russia has suffered one setback and loss after another. Its progress has been slow, its gains minimal, and its losses staggering. Even this summer, when the Kremlin mustered enormous force, threw everything it had at Ukraine, and boldly declared this to be the final push for victory, it failed once again. As October draws to a close, the much-discussed summer offensive has effectively ended, and the results are nothing short of disastrous for the Kremlin. Now, of course, you will hear some media reports emphasizing that Russia has made some gains in certain areas during this period. Or you will see analyses pointing out that Ukraine is currently struggling with a manpower shortage, while Russia somehow finds ways to add tens of thousands of new soldiers to its army every month. At first glance, this situation might suggest that the offensive was not so unsuccessful after all, and that Russia is even on track to achieve more valuable gains by the end of the year. But is everything really as it seems? When we dig a little deeper, the facts and statistics that emerged after the summer offensive tell a very different story. And it's a story that the Kremlin will definitely not be happy to hear. Analysts at reputable European-based publications recently took a deep dive into statistics, open-source intelligence, charts, and casualty reports, and came to a very clear and definitive conclusion about Russia's current situation and future prospects. Their conclusion is this: Russia's summer offensive is ending. Many in the West focus on the slow progress of their troops and Ukraine's emerging manpower shortage. But this is looking through the wrong end of the telescope. What is truly striking is how little territory Russia has gained in this third and largest offensive, and the horrific price it has paid in terms of soldiers and equipment. Unless there is a dramatic change, Vladimir Putin will not win this war on the battlefield. That he continues to try shows that he has run out of ideas. This is undoubtedly a harsh statement, but it is supported by undeniable evidence. While it is impossible to measure exactly how much territory each side controls, we have plenty of data to guide our reasonable estimates. There are open-source satellite images and live conflict maps. Analysts working with this data have found that Russia has not gained significant territory in any conceivable scenario. In fact, if we examine regional control charts dating back to the start of the war, Russia controls less territory today than it did at various stages in 2022. The Kremlin had managed to seize more than 25% of Ukrainian territory in the early stages of the war. However, when Ukraine began to regroup and launched its first major counteroffensive, the battle lines stabilized. Russia's total control dropped to around 20% and has remained roughly the same since then. This indicates that the war is in a complete stalemate. Time and again, we see Russian forces advance slightly, perhaps capturing a few square kilometers of farmland or an abandoned village. But shortly thereafter, Ukraine usually finds a way to retake these areas and push the Russians back. This cycle repeats itself over and over, with both sides doing little more than trading the same worthless pieces of land. As observers have noted, when it comes to large and important cities, Russia has not captured a single one since October 2022. Of course it tried. For example, it mobilized a massive force of over 100,000 troops in a desperate attempt to capture the city of Pokrovsk in Donetsk. However, all this was in vain. Ukraine's defenders maintained tight control over the most important locations, such as the famous Fortress Belt. that provides the Ukrainian armed forces with a solid defensive base and strong logistical links throughout the region, including Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, and Druzhkivka. It has been proven that capturing even one of these cities is an impossible task for Putin's army, despite its apparent massive advantages in tanks, manpower, and equipment. So, if they cannot capture a single city in 3 years, don't you think it's ridiculous to expect the Kremlin to win this war anytime soon? Indeed, as Western analyses point out, if the war and Russia's advance continue as they have over the past month, it will take until 2030 for Russia to capture just the 4 regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, that Putin mentioned when he launched his special military operation. Moreover, if Russia wants to occupy all of Ukraine, which Vladimir Putin has clearly stated his intention to do by recently declaring that all of Ukraine belongs to Russia, this will take approximately 103 years, according to the best estimates. Perhaps this is why Putin was recently heard saying to his Chinese counterpart while discussing organ transplants and immortality, "It is estimated that it will be possible to live to 150 years of age in this century." Putin is currently 73 years old, and even if he found some kind of elixir of youth and lived to be 150, that wouldn't be enough time for him to see his country conquer all of Ukraine. In short, the dream of conquest will remain just that, a dream. This brings us to the most shocking point in this extraordinary report. Reporters who compiled data from numerous sources and used over 200 reliable casualty estimates were able to make an extremely accurate, reliable, and data-driven assessment of how many Russian soldiers have lost their lives and how many have been wounded and forced to leave the front lines since the war began. What they found was, in a word, staggering. According to their meta-estimate, from the start of the full-scale invasion until January of this year, Russian casualties ranged from 640,000 to 877,000 soldiers, of whom 137,000 to 228,000 were killed. By October 13th, these totals had increased by nearly 60% to between 984,000 and 1,438,000 casualties, including between 190,000 and 199,000 casualties, 480,000 dead. Let's pause for a moment. Even in the best-case scenario, looking at the lower end of the estimated range, Russia still lost approximately 1 million soldiers, with nearly 200,000 killed. This aligns with what many other sources, including the UK Ministry of Defense, have mentioned. Many estimated that Russia had surpassed the 1 million casualty milestone during the summer months. However, if we look at the upper end of the estimated range, Russian casualties could be much worse than expected. Over 1.4 million casualties in total and nearly 500,000 dead. In either case, this is by far the worst war for Russia since World War II, and when we look at the insignificant territory gained in exchange for these horrific losses, it is also one of the most wasteful wars of all time anywhere in the world. Countless lives have been lost, families forced to mourn the deaths of their brothers, husbands, fathers, and sons, all with almost no tangible gains in terms of territory or battlefield dominance. Russia is not capturing the towns and cities it needs to advance, marching towards victory. Instead, viewing its people as no different from cattle, it recklessly throws its soldiers into the meat grinder. It always trusts that it can call up new ones to replace those lost the previous week or month. For now, there is some truth to this statement, as Russia is still regularly meeting and even exceeding its conscription targets. This was confirmed in a recent report by Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, GUR. According to the report, the Kremlin has recruited approximately 280,000 new contract personnel since the beginning of the year and is on track to reach its year-end target of 343,000 new soldiers. However, again, this does not tell the whole story. We need to dig deeper to see just how reckless and desperate Russia's recruitment strategy really is. For example, in order to continue bringing in the numbers needed to compensate for its losses, the Kremlin has resorted to recruiting hundreds of thousands of prisoners, including rapists and murderers. These individuals may eventually be released onto Russian streets if they survive long enough to complete their contracts. Russian recruitment officers are also turning to hospitals, enlisting individuals with chronic medical conditions, such as HIV and hepatitis. It is not expected that people with such health issues will have much impact in the frenzied frontline battles. There is only one reason why many healthy and strong new soldiers are in the Russian ranks: money. The Kremlin has never hidden the fact that it offers huge cash incentives to those who volunteer to fight in Ukraine. Many men, often from low-income areas, join the war as a way to support their families. But this cannot last forever. especially at a time when the Russian economy is in such a precarious position. Losing vast amounts of money every day and grappling with a crippling fuel crisis, the Kremlin cannot hope to recruit willing and capable soldiers indefinitely. As analysis reports also indicate, it is particularly striking that Russia's casualty figures have increased by approximately 60% between January and October of this year alone. This makes 2025 one of the bloodiest years on record for the Russian Federation, and demonstrates how disastrously the Kremlin has managed this war and squandered its resources. Yet it stubbornly persists with the same failed tactics, throwing its men into the fire and hoping that somehow the tide will turn in its favor. But as analysts point out, this is highly unlikely. Moreover, given the way the two armies conduct the war, a sudden collapse of Ukraine's defensive lines seems unlikely. Constant drone surveillance, combined with long-range precision weapons, has made massing forces near the front line tantamount to suicide. Gains through advance are still possible, but only by sending small groups of men to capture forward positions in the death zone at enormous cost. Breaking through Ukrainian lines is difficult. Even if a breach occurs, advancing the necessary massed forces and equipment to exploit it is extremely difficult. In other words, the continuation of the aforementioned stalemate is almost guaranteed. This means that Russia is guaranteed to continue losing more soldiers, with almost no significant gains, in an increasingly egregious example of waste and futility. Then the analysis dropped an even bigger bombshell. Again, it used all the reliable sources it could find to make a credible and realistic estimate of how many Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in the war so far. It found that Ukraine has lost at least 77,403 soldiers and has 77,842 missing since the full-scale invasion began. Looking at this year's figures, Ukraine appears to have lost at least 8,668 people, but analysts note that this is a lower bound and the actual number could be significantly higher. However, even if the actual number of Ukrainian soldier deaths in 2025 is twice the lower bound estimate, this figure is still strikingly lower than the estimated number of Russian deaths during the same period. In fact, the figures show that for every Ukrainian death this year, roughly 5 Russian soldiers have lost their lives. Therefore, while many headlines and reports focus on Russia's widespread conscription and Ukraine's manpower crisis, the numbers tell a distinctly different story. If these casualty rates continue or do not improve significantly for Russia, manpower will become a much bigger problem for Moscow than for Kiev. Because, as noted, Russia cannot sustain this indefinitely. When the war began, they did not struggle so much to recruit new soldiers. They offered generous participation bonuses, and there were many people who believed the lies of the special military operation, hoping to earn easy money and return home within months, even weeks, to raise a victory toast with their loved ones. However, as the war dragged on, more people saw the true face of the war. Now Russia is forced to call up people who have already shown their reluctance to fight, having stood on the sidelines for over 3 years. And each new recruit is more aware of what they are getting into. Many probably know they will never return home to see their families again. As a result, Russia may see the number of willing applicants begin to decline in the coming months, and the Kremlin may then be forced to offer even more lucrative contracts and larger participation bonuses to bolster its ranks, or resort to more desperate measures. Russia also cannot rely on wounded troops fully recovering and returning to the front. An International Strategic Research Institute's report estimates that only 40% of all wounded soldiers will be fit enough to fight again. Thinking longer term, if the war drags on for years, Russia will become dependent on people who are young now and will turn 18 and be legally allowed to join the army. Last year, 800,000 Russian youths celebrated their 18th birthdays, but probably only a small fraction will be eager to risk their young lives in Ukraine. In short, Russia may be barely managing to create enough manpower supply to meet demand for now. But this delicate balance will inevitably shift over time, and there will not be enough soldiers left to cover the losses. Of course, soldiers are not the only resource that the Russian war machine has lost in large numbers since the war began. Equipment is another major problem. According to data compiled by Dutch open-source intelligence trackers, Russia has lost more than 12,500 tanks and armored combat vehicles, plus 2,674 artillery and missile systems, 166 aircraft, including fighter jets and bombers, and 164 helicopters. Moreover, all these figures are lower bounds And while some Ukrainian sources claim Russia has actually lost close to 10,000 tanks and well over 20,000 armored vehicles, the real numbers could be much higher. While most of the lost equipment can be replaced, all of it requires money, time, and resources, and Russia is rapidly running out of all three. Moreover, the war is slowly but surely turning in Ukraine's favor. For example, analysis reports indicate that after a brief pause in American aid from late 2023 to early 2024, Ukraine is now receiving record levels of support from allies around the world. The U.S. appears more determined than ever to help Ukraine, announcing new intelligence-sharing partnerships and raising the possibility of delivering long-range Tomahawk missiles. Other nations in Europe are also doing their part to provide the funds and tools needed to give Ukraine a tactical advantage. In addition to these massive military losses, the Kremlin faces another crisis: economic collapse. The pressure on the front lines is not only military. The real chaos is erupting far behind the front lines, within Russia itself. Ukraine's ruthless and extremely well-planned strategic attacks are striking critical oil infrastructure facilities one by one. With refineries and pipelines ablaze, Russia has lost nearly 40% of its oil refining capacity. This is leading to a rapidly spreading gasoline shortage and scenes of near anarchy in some areas. A drop in exports and hundreds of empty gas stations are imminent. When all these military disasters are combined with this dependence on such inefficient, short-term approaches, the result is catastrophic. Rising prices and a weakening economy are inevitable. Putin's desk is overflowing with unsolvable problems. The conclusion reached by Western analysts is very clear. The Russian economy could collapse long before the defense of Ukraine. To explore in more depth how the war is rapidly slipping from Putin's grasp, and how the Russian leaders' growing frustration and lack of ideas are fueling anger among the Russian elite and the public, check out our video. Or watch this video to see how Putin's Asian friends, North Korea and China, are exploiting the Kremlin's weakness to expand their dominance in Russia's Far East. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to be the first to learn the most important facts and developments from the Ukrainian front lines and around the world.